that NHL teams will not play at the expiration of the CBA until we have a new system which fixes the economic problems facing our game.
310 days. That's how long the NHL locked its doors and told every player in the league to find somewhere else to be.
We have no other choice.
The Stars flew to Europe and kept skating. The veterans on the fringe waited by the phone. The league came back. 200 careers did not. Nobody held a press conference for them. The league told you this was about competitive balance. So why did the people it hurt most have nothing to do with the balance problem? The problem was structural, and it had been building for years before anyone walked out of a building over it. By the 2003-04 season, NHL clubs were spending 76% of their total revenues on player salaries, which was the highest ratio in North American professional sport and not particularly close. Several franchises were operationally insolvent, burning through cash with no mechanism to stop the bleeding. And a league's own commissioned report put collective losses at $273 million for the 2002-03 season alone. The owners looked at those numbers and arrived at one conclusion: a hard salary cap, a ceiling that no team could exceed, period. The players looked at those same numbers and arrived at a different one: absolutely not. The man on the players' side was Bob Goodenow, and to understand why he drew the line where he did, you have to understand what he had already built. When Goodenow took over as the executive director of the NHLPA in 1992, the average NHL salary sat at roughly $276,000. By 2003-04, he had pushed that number to approximately $1.8 million, a rise of more than 550% in just over a decade. And every dollar of that increase had come through collective bargaining leverage that Goodenow had spent his career constructing. His position was not irrational. He believed, with some justification, that once a salary cap existed, the owners would spend the next 20 years trying to push it lower, and the players would never claw back what they had given up. He told the union to hold the line, and the union listened. The man on the other side was Gary Bettman, and he had been here before. Bettman came to the NHL from the NBA, where he had served as senior vice president and general counsel and had played a key role in developing basketball's soft salary cap back in 1983. He understood how caps worked, why owners wanted them, and what it took to get one installed against a union that didn't want it. This was not his first negotiation from the ownership side of a table, and it showed in a way the league conducted itself throughout the dispute, with a patience that looked an awful lot like a willingness to wait the players out for as long as it took. On September 16, 2004, one day after the collective bargaining agreement expired, Bettman locked the players out. The two sides began what would become the longest labor standoff in the history of North American professional sport. And from the first day, the distance between their positions was not a gap. It was a canyon. And somewhere between them, invisible to both sides because neither was looking, sat a third group that had no seat at the table and no one fighting for them. Both sides said they were doing this for the good of the game. But the good of the game is a phrase that sounds different depending on where you're standing. And for the men at the margins of NHL rosters, no one in that room was standing anywhere near them. On February 16, 2005, Gary Bettman walked to a podium and canceled the season.
Accordingly, I have no choice but to announce the formal cancellation of play for 2004-2005.
The Stanley Cup, which had been awarded every year since 1893, with the sole exception of 1919 when the Spanish flu forced the cancellation of the finals with the series tied, would not be awarded.
The NHL made the announcement today: no playoff run, no hoisting the Stanley Cup, and no shortage of emotions.
The NHL became the first major professional sports league in North America to cancel an entire season because of a labor dispute. And the building where Bettman made the announcement was quieter than you would expect for a moment that was historic. There was no shock left in the room by that point. Everyone had seen it coming for weeks. But the season wasn't canceled in a boardroom. It was canceled in every locker room in the league, every practice facility, every apartment where a player was waiting for a phone call that would tell him when to come back. And the cost was not distributed evenly. Jaromir Jagr went home to play for HC Kladno in the Czech Republic, the club where he had started as a teenager and then signed with Avangard Omsk in Russia when he wanted a higher level of competition. Patrick Elias played for Orly Snoimo in the Czech Republic before joining Metallurg Magnitogorsk in Russia, where he contracted hepatitis A from the food, lost 30 pounds, and spent nearly a month in a Czech hospital recovering. Even the stars paid a price, but their price came with a return ticket. Jagr came back to the Rangers. Elias came back to the Devils. 388 NHL players were scattered across European leagues that season. And for the men whose names you already knew, the lockout was an interruption. Uncomfortable and occasionally dangerous, but an interruption all the same. Now think about the man whose name you did not know, because he's the one this story is actually about. He's 32 years old. He's played parts of 4 seasons in the NHL and spent the rest of his career in the American Hockey League, riding buses between cities that don't sell out arenas, playing for contracts that wouldn't cover the mortgage on the house his teammates in the show just bought. Last season, he finally scratched his way onto an NHL roster for 12 games, enough to feel what it was like to belong there, not enough to guarantee he would be back. He was told to wait until training camp, that there would be a spot, that his work had not gone unnoticed. And then the lockout wiped out the season, and he waited. He waited through September and October, through the holidays, through February when the announcement came, and through the spring when the negotiations resumed, and when the league finally came back in the fall of 2005, the phone didn't ring. It wasn't that anyone had decided he was finished. It was that the league had changed the rules while he was sitting still. And by the time the doors reopened, the roster spot he had been promised no longer existed in the same way. That was the reality for a cohort of players who were old enough to be on the wrong side of a rebuild and young enough to have years left if the math had worked differently. They didn't retire. They weren't cut for performance. They simply ran out of time during a year when the clock wasn't supposed to be running. And then there were the legends, and their story is different in kind, but identical in outcome. Scott Stevens, who had been dealing with post-concussion syndrome and was expecting to return, never played again after the lockout erased the season he needed to get healthy. Al MacInnis, whose eye injury had already cost him most of 2003-04, couldn't justify coming back after 2 full years away from the game. Ron Francis, Mark Messier, Adam Oates, and Igor Larionov, all of them Hall of Famers, all of them used the lockout as a natural exit point because the league had given them no season to come back to. Each of those careers ended 1 year shorter than it would have been. Collectively, that represents thousands of games that were never played, and a generation of hockey that was simply deleted from the record. These men are not the primary subject of this story. They had their careers. They had their legacies, but they are the hinge between the superstars who came back from Europe and the fringe players who never came back at all. And the fact that even Hall of Famers lost something to this lockout tells you everything about how indiscriminate the damage was. The NHL had a word for what came next. They called it cost certainty. What the players who never came back called it, nobody asked. On July 13th, 2005, the two sides reached an agreement, and the terms told you exactly who had won. The players would receive 54% of total league revenues, with a salary floor set at $21.5 million to ensure that even the cheapest owners had to ice a competitive roster. In exchange, the owners got their hard cap at $39 million per team, the thing Goodenow had spent a decade swearing would never exist and had told every player in the union to sacrifice a full season to prevent. 5 days after the players ratified the deal, Goodenow resigned. The man who had raised average salaries by more than 550% over his tenure walked away because he had lost the central argument, the one he had skated everything on. Ted Saskin, who had served as the union's senior director of business affairs and had played a key role in the final negotiations, replaced him. The mood among the players was not celebratory. By most accounts, it was closer to relief. The feeling you get when something painful is finally over and you're not sure whether the result was worth what it cost. The mechanics of the new deal reshaped every roster in the league overnight. Every existing player contract was rolled back by 24%. A player who had signed for $5 million was now making $3.8 million. And teams that had been carrying payrolls well above the new ceiling were suddenly forced to shed salary in a matter of weeks. The players who got cut were not the stars. They were the ones closest to the margin. The veterans on modest contracts whose value to a team was real but not irreplaceable. The men a general manager could let go without the fan base noticing until mid-season. And the cap was only half of the redesign. Alongside it, the league introduced a package of rule changes that fundamentally altered the way the game was played. The shootout replaced ties. Obstruction penalties were enforced with a severity that the old NHL would not have recognized. The neutral zone trap, the defensive system that had slowed the game to a crawl for the better part of a decade, was legislated into irrelevance. The intent behind all of it was to make hockey faster, more exciting, more marketable to a television audience that had been watching the sport hemorrhage viewers for years. And it worked, at least in terms of the product on the ice. The game did get faster, skill players had more room to operate, and scoring climbed. But a faster game is less forgiving of the veteran who's lost half a step. And a league that now prioritizes speed and transition over size and physicality has just rewritten the job description for every bottom six forward and every third pairing defenseman in the sport. The cap alone didn't end 200 careers. The cap and the rule changes together did, because they arrived at the same time and pointed in the same direction. And the players who were caught between them had no leverage to push back against either. The league sold this as a competitive balance fix. And by one measure, it worked beautifully. The salary floor meant that small market teams could ice a real roster, that a club in Nashville or Columbus didn't have to watch its best players leave for New York or Detroit every July. But competitive balance for whom? For which 23 men on a roster? Because the floor helped the franchise, and the cap helped the owners, and the rule changes helped the fans. And none of it helped the 33-year-old forward who had just been told his contract no longer existed. The cap era worked exactly the way it was designed to work, and the people it was designed for have done extremely well. Revenue grew fast from the start. The league generated over $2.2 billion in its first post-lockout season, and by 2011-12, annual revenue had climbed to over $3.3 billion, setting records for the fifth consecutive year. Teams that had been hovering near bankruptcy stabilized. The cap itself climbed from $39 million in 2005-06 to $81.5 million by 2019-20, a reflection of a league that was generating more money every single year. Every stakeholder with an ownership stake won the lockout, and they have kept winning ever since. The player on the fringe had no ownership stake. What he had was a year of his career taken by a labor dispute between two groups of wealthy men arguing over percentages. When the league came back, teams needed to fit under a cap, which meant investing in younger players who were cheaper, faster, and had more years of cost-controlled production ahead of them. The 30-year-old who needed one more season to hit a pension threshold didn't get that season. The cap made him a financial liability before he could prove he was still a hockey player. And no general manager in the league was going to spend limited cap space finding out. Here's the thing nobody says out loud even now. Every time a team talks about roster flexibility or cap management or asset optimization, it's describing a calculation that has always been paid for by the people at the bottom of the structure. The lockout didn't invent that math, but it hard-coded it into the rulebook, turned it from a choice into a requirement, and removed whatever discretion a general manager might have exercised in keeping a veteran around for one more year because he had earned it. Go back to the question from the beginning. The league said this was about competitive balance, and the players who paid the highest price for that balance were the ones who had absolutely nothing to do with the financial problem the league was trying to solve. They were not the players making $10 million a year. They were not the reason franchises were losing money. They weren't overpaid, they weren't the problem, and they weren't even part of the conversation. They were simply in the way of the solution, and the solution did not slow down to ask whether they mattered. The NHL got its salary cap. The owners got their cost certainty. And the 200 players who never came back got what exactly? The NHL called what happened in 2005 a new era. For most of the league, it was. For the players who were not there to see it, it was just an ending without a ceremony. If this one stayed with you, joining our Healthy Scratch membership below genuinely helps keep stories like this getting made. Priority comment replies, loyalty badges, exclusive emojis, and early access to videos. Next time, we look at a player the game simply erased. Subscribe before you go.